Hello and welcome to this session, and in this session we shall continue our understanding of the types of verbs. Well, in this session particularly we shall be discussing about the finite and the non-finite verbs, and let me tell you that this distinction is based on the subject. Well, what does all of this mean is something that you shall definitely understand by the end of this session. So let me proceed and firstly tell you as to what really the finite verbs are. Firstly, let me speak about the finite verbs, and let me tell you that finite verbs are such verbs that are bound by the subject, and any change that we make to the subject shall also get reflected in the corresponding finite verb. Well, what it means is that just in case I change the number of subjects in the sentence, then the finite verb shall change. Similarly, if I change the subject's tense in the sentence, even then the finite verb shall show a corresponding change, and accordingly, if the subject's person is changed, then also the change gets reflected in the finite verb. In fact, such verbs that reflect a change whenever there is a change in the subject's number or the subject's tense or the subject's person is what we refer to as the finite verbs. Well, if all of this is confusing, let me give you examples to show to you as to how really the finite verbs are used in a sentence. Have a look at this example. He eats apples. Well, you know that in this case eats happens to be the verb, but then the question is it a finite verb or a non-finite verb? Well, I shall be telling you about that moving forward, but if I will ask you to identify the subject in this sentence, then I am sure that you shall be identifying he as the subject of the sentence, and I am sure that you pretty much realize that it happens to be a singular subject. But then if in case I change this singular subject to a plural subject, what I mean to say is that instead of he, if in case I happen to use they, then this sentence they eats apples definitely is not a grammatically valid sentence. In other words, the verb here definitely is not the right kind of verb to be used, and if you'll ask me what is the right verb, then I will have to replace eats with eat. Now the sentence they eat apples definitely is a grammatically valid English sentence, but then what you have noticed here is that as the subject changed from the singular form to the plural form, the verb also changed from eats to eat. In fact, such verbs that change whenever a change in the subject number happens is what we refer to as the finite verbs, and let me tell you that in these sentences both eats as well as eat happens to be finite verb, because you can notice the change in the verb as the subject number changes. But then let me tell you that this change is not just limited to the subject number. If the subject tense changes, even then these verbs change. Well, what does that mean? Have a look at the same example again. He eats apples. Well, let me tell you that this sentence happens to be in the present tense. Well, that way sentences could be in the present tense, the past tense, or the future tense, and what are the various combinations of the different tenses in which a sentence could exist is something that I shall be clarifying to you in detail in my upcoming sessions. But at this point in time, when we have to understand the concept of finite verbs, what I can tell you is that this sentence happens to be in the present tense, and just in case I have to express the same sentence in the past tense, then I will have to express it like this: he ate apples. Well, you can notice that there is a change in the verb. If and only if you are going to change eats to ate, only then the tense of the sentence shall change from present to past. In other words, what you really have to notice here is that both eats and ate happen to be finite verbs. Why is it so? Because as the tense of the sentence has changed, the verb also has changed. And whenever there is a change in the tense, if the verb also changes, then such verbs is what we call as the finite verbs. Well, that way what you have now been able to understand is that the finite verbs are such verbs that change whenever the subject number changes and whenever the subject tense changes. But then not just that, what you also have to understand is that the finite verbs also change as the subject person changes. Well, what does that mean? Let me tell you. Have a look at these three words in English: I, you, and he. And let me tell you that in English, in a sentence, if you are going to be using the word I, then it means that that sentence is a first person sentence. After all, you are referring to yourself, right, by telling I, which means that the sentence is in first person. But just in case, instead of I in the sentence, you happen to use you, then it means that the sentence is in the second person. After all, you are not referring to it as I, you are referring to it as another person, you, which means that it refers to the second person, and hence the sentence in which you will use you is said to be in the second person. And similarly, whenever you happen to say he, then it means that neither is it the first person sentence nor the second person sentence, rather it happens to be the third person sentence. Yes, moving forward, in detail, I shall be speaking about all of the different types of sentences, during which I shall discuss the first person sentence, the second person sentence, and the third person sentence in great detail. But at this point in time, when we have to understand the concept of finite verbs, all that I can tell you is that such sentences in which I is used is referred to as the first person sentence, such sentences in which you is used is referred to as the second person sentence, and such in which he is used is referred to as the third person sentence. But then why am I telling all of this to you at this point in time? And that is because now I will use I and have this sentence: I eat apple. Well, this is a first person sentence, and just in case you have to express this in the second person sentence, then I am sure that you would tell it as you eat apples. Yes, this sentence happens to be in the second person, but then if you will have to express it in the third person, then you cannot say it as he eat apples. Well, this becomes a grammatically wrong sentence, and hence if you really have to make a proper valid third person sentence, then you will have to change the verb from eat to eats. Yes, now he eats apples becomes a valid third person sentence. In other words, what you have been able to understand here is that eat as well as eats happens to be the verb in these sentences. But then you can notice that there is a change in the verb as the sentence person changes from the second person to the third person. Of course, there is no change in the verb between the first person and the second person sentence, but then between the second and the third, you can see that the verb eat changes to eats. In other words, finite verbs change with the change in the subject person as well, is what you are able to notice here, that when the person was the second person, the verb was eat, but then in the third person, it changed to eats. All said and done, eat and eats here also happen to be the finite verbs. In general, what you have been able to understand through these examples is that finite verbs happen to be such verbs that change with the change in the subject number, with the change in the subject tense, and with the change in the subject person. So, all said and done, I am sure now you have been able to somewhat understand the definition of the finite verbs, but then when I would give you a few more examples now moving forward, that it shall become completely clear. So, have a look at this next example. She sings melodiously. Well, in this case, sings happens to be the verb, but then again the question is whether it is the finite or the non-finite verb. Well, that way she happens to be the subject in this sentence and it happens to be the singular subject. Well, if you'll really have to verify if sings happens to be a finite or a non-finite verb, all that you have to do is to change the subject number. What I mean to say is that she is a singular subject, and what you have to do is to make it a plural subject. Well, you know that if I'm going to replace she with they, then obviously you have transformed the singular subject to the plural subject. But then the sentence is invalid. They sings melodiously is invalid. In other words, you need to bring a corresponding change in the verb as well. And if really this sentence has to be a valid sentence, then you need to change the verb sings to sing. Only then they sing melodiously becomes a valid, grammatically correct English sentence. So what you can again notice in this example is that as the subject changed from the singular form to the plural form, the verb also changed from sings to sing. In other words, such verbs that change whenever there is a change in the subject number is what we refer to as the finite verbs, and hence in these examples sings and sing happens to be the finite verbs. But then, as you have already learned, that finite verbs don't just change with the change in the subject number, they also change with the change in the subject tense. What I mean to say is, again, I would take the same example. She sings melodiously. Here, the sentence happens to be in the present tense. Again, moving forward, you shall understand all of the different tenses that a sentence could exist in, but at this point in time, what I can tell you is that this happens to be in the present tense, and just in case I have to transform this sentence to the past tense, then I will have to be changing the verb sings to sang. Yes, she sang melodiously is the proper past tense of the corresponding present tense sentence. In other words, what you can notice here is that whenever you have to change the tense of the sentence, even then the corresponding verb is getting changed from sings to sang. In other words, such verbs that change whenever there is a change in the tense of the sentence is also what we refer to as the finite verbs. But then, as you have already previously learned, that finite verbs don't just change with the change in the subject number and change with the change in the subject tense. They also change as the subject person changes. Well, what I mean to say is that you already know that I stands for the first person, you stands for the second person, and he or she stands for the third person. And just in case I have to express the sentence in first person, then I sing melodiously happens to be the first person sentence with sing as the verb. But then the second person sentence would be you sing melodiously. Again, here sing happens to be the verb. But then if you'll really have to express it in third person, then you cannot tell it as she sing melodiously. No, the valid sentence is going to be she sings melodiously. In other words, you can notice even in this case that there is a change in the verb whenever you are changing the person from the second person to the third person. You can notice that sing has become sings. In other words, such verbs that reflect a change whenever there is a change in the subject person is also referred to as the finite verbs. So now if you would look back at the definition of the finite verbs, I am sure you have been able to completely understand the definition, but then it shall become even more clear when I will give you one more example. So have a look at this next example. She plays guitar well. You know that here plays happens to be the verb and she happens to be the singular subject. But then just in case I change this singular subject she to plural subject they, then the sentence becomes invalid. They plays guitar well definitely is an invalid sentence in English, and if you'll really have to make it a valid English sentence, then you'll have to replace the verb plays with play. In other words, what you are noticing here is that as the subject changes from the singular form to the plural form, the verb also has changed from plays to play, which means that plays and play happen to be finite verbs. Well, after all, you know that finite verbs are such verbs that change whenever there is a change in the subject number. But then you know that they also change whenever the tense of the sentence changes. What I mean to say is, let me again take the same sentence. And you know that she plays guitar well happens to be in the present tense, and in case I have to express this sentence in the past tense, then I will have to express it like this. Yes, I will have to make use of the verb played, only then the sentence shall be transformed to the past tense. So, what it effectively means is that whenever there is a change in the tense of the sentence from the present to the past, the corresponding verb also changes from place to played. And because the verb is changing from place to played, that we identify these verbs as the finite verbs. After all, the finite verbs happen to be such verbs that change whenever there is a change in the sentence's tense as well. But then you know that this happens to be the first person sentence, this happens to be the second person sentence, and this happens to be the third person sentence. And I'm sure now you can notice that whenever the sentence changes from the second person to the third person, you can notice that the verb also has changed from play to place. In other words, whenever there is a change in the subject person, that the verb also is changing, and hence we categorize this as the finite verbs. So, all said and done, I am sure that through all of my examples, you have been able to understand the definition of the finite verbs. Finite verbs actually are such verbs that change whenever there is a change in the subject number or the tense of the sentence, or whenever there is a change in the subject person. But then the question is, what really are the non-finite verbs? Well, let me tell you that non-finite verbs are exact opposite of the finite verbs. Well, what I really mean to say is that while the finite verbs change when any of these changes, let me tell you that the non-finite verbs do not change when any of these changes. Well, what does all of this mean? Let me explain it to you through a few examples. Have a look at this example. The sleeping puppy is brown. Well, I'm sure that you easily identify sleeping as the verb here, but then the real question is whether is it the finite verb or the non-finite verb, for which I shall be giving you the answer. But then the subject of this sentence is puppy, and you know that it is a singular subject. But then, just in case, I am going to express this sentence wherein it is containing a plural subject like this. Well, you know, after all, puppies happens to represent plural subjects. But then what you really have to notice in this sentence is that the verb has not changed. The sleeping is the verb which has remained the same. In other words, even though there is a change in the subject number from singular to plural, the verb has not changed, and it is such verbs that we refer to as the non-finite verbs. Well, not just with respect to the subject number. These are such verbs that do not change even when the tense of the sentence changes. Well, what I mean is, have a look at this sentence. Well, again here, this sentence is said to be in the present tense because you must notice this word is. Is means that we are talking about the present tense. But then, just in case I express this in the past tense, then you can notice that we make use of the word was over here. But then don't have your focus on these words is and was. What you really have to focus is on the verb. You can notice that sleeping is the verb in the present tense. Sleeping is the verb even in the past tense. In other words, though the tense of the sentence changed from the present tense to the past tense, yet the verb did not change. It remained the same. And it is in fact such verbs that we refer to as the non-finite verbs. Well, not just with respect to the tense of the sentence, let me tell you that these happen to be such verbs that do not change even when the subject person changes. Well, what I mean to say is, have a look at this sentence. The word my indicates that this sentence happens to be in first person. But then have a look at this sentence. In this, you can notice the word your, which indicates that this sentence happens to be a second person sentence. And then have a look at this. Well, here the word his indicates that this sentence happens to be in the third person. In other words, be it the first, the second, or the third person sentence, what you have to notice is the verb in the sentences. You can notice that there is absolutely no change in the verb. The verb is sleeping all through. In other words, what I mean to say is that sleeping happens to be such a verb which is not changing when the subject person changes, and it is such verbs that we refer to as the non-finite verbs. So now if you would look back at the definition of the non-finite verbs, now I am sure that you understand that non-finite verbs happen to be such verbs that are not attached to the subject. What I mean to say is that they do not change when the subject number changes, or the tense of the sentence changes, or the subject person changes. It is such verbs that we refer to as the non-finite verbs. Anyway, let me give you a few more examples to clarify this for you. Have a look at this example. The flying kite is colorful. I'm sure that in this example you have already identified flying to be the verb, and let me tell you that it happens to be the non-finite verb. Anyway, I'll explain as to why it is non-finite moving forward, but then I'm sure that you know that kite happens to be the singular subject in this sentence. And just in case I express this sentence such that it contains a plural subject like this, after all, you know that kites represent plural subject. But then what I really want you to focus is on the verb. Well, you can notice that there is no change in the verb, and still the sentence is perfectly valid. In other words, flying happens to be such a verb that does not change when the subject number changes from singular to plural, and it is such verbs that we refer to as the non-finite verb. Not just that, have a look at this sentence. Here, the word is indicates that the sentence is in the present tense. But then, just in case I happen to express this sentence in the past tense like this. After all, the word was indicates that this sentence is in the past tense, but then, be it the present or the past tense, the verb is the same. There is no change in the verb. In other words, such verbs that do not change even when the tense of the sentence changes is what we refer to as the non-finite verbs. Not just that, have a look at this sentence. Here, the word my indicates that the sentence is in the first person. And then have a look at this sentence. Here, the word your indicates that the sentence is in second person. And have a look at this. Here, the word his indicates that the sentence is in the third person. But then, whether the sentence is in the first or the second or the third person, what I really want you to notice is the verb. The verb is the same. There is absolutely no change in the verb. In other words, flying happens to be such a verb that does not change when the subject person changes, and hence is categorized as the non-finite verb. So, all said and done, I am sure now the definition of the non-finite verb is completely clear to you, and let me now give you one final example before I end this session. Have a look at this example. The barking dog is annoying. Well, I am sure that in this example you have already identified barking to be the verb and dog to be the singular subject, but just in case I express this in the plural form like this. After all, dogs happens to be the plural subject, but then the verb barking has not changed. In other words, barking happens to be such a verb which remains the same even though there is a change in the subject from the singular to the plural form, and hence we categorize such verbs as the non-finite verbs. And not just that, have a look at this. In this sentence, the word is indicating that the sentence is in the present tense. And just in case I happen to express this sentence in the past tense, then this is how I can express it. And here the word was is indicating that the sentence happens to be in the past tense. But then what you really have to focus is on the verb. The verb barking has not changed, even though the sentence changed from the present tense to the past tense, and it is such verbs that do not change even though the tense of the sentence changes is what we refer to as the non-finite verb. Not just that, have a look at this sentence. Due to the word my here, that we categorize this to be the first person sentence. Look at this. Due to the word you are here, that we categorize this sentence to be as the second person sentence. And look at this. Here, due to the word his, this sentence is categorized as the third person sentence. But then what I really want you to notice is again the verb. The verb barking has not changed, even though the subject person changed from the first to the second to the third, and it is such verbs that do not change when the subject person changes is what we refer to as the non-finite verbs. So all said and done, I'm sure in this session you have been able to understand that these happens to be the characteristics of the finite verbs and these happen to be the characteristics of the non-finite verb, and I'm sure now you have been able to completely understand as to what really the finite and the non-finite verbs are. But then there are still a few more categorizations that you need to understand, and if you'll really have to understand even those categorization of verbs and master this part of speech, then meet me in my next session. Thanks for watching. Let's again meet in the next session.